On stage, George Hamilton IV was the national father to millions of viewers. But behind the velvet curtain, his own son, George Hamilton V, stood there like an outsider. He shared the same name and face as his father, but he wasn't considered an independent person. He was merely a living ornament to enhance his father's perfection. Every night, he pledged his love to 3,000 strangers, yet remained a stranger to his own son. He wasn't addicted to drugs. He was addicted to applause. And to maintain his title of the world's kindest man, he sacrificed the one thing that truly mattered, his son's identity. George Hamilton IV was not born into the mythology of the American South. He didn't pick cotton. He didn't work in a coal mine. He didn't hop freight trains to escape the Dust Bowl. His origin story lacked the grit and the dirt that usually fertilize country music legends. He was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina in 1937. He was born into the comfortable, respectable middle class. His grandfather was a railroad executive. His father was a strict, upright man who believed in manners, in appearance, and in the social order. George grew up in a world of starched collars and Sunday schools. He was the golden boy of Winston-Salem. He was handsome in a safe, non-threatening way. He was articulate. He was the kind of boy mothers hoped their daughters would marry. He didn't have to fight to survive. He had to fight to be polite. And in 1956, when he was just a 19-year-old college student at the University of North Carolina, lightning struck. He wrote a song. It wasn't a song about prison or heartache. It was a song about teenage love, sweet and sticky and innocent. It was called A Rose and a Baby Ruth. It is vital to pause here and look at the world George Hamilton IV was stepping into. 1956 was the year the earth shook. It was the year Elvis Presley swiveled his hips on national television and terrified every parent in America. Rock and roll had arrived, and it was dangerous. It was sexual. It was black music played by white boys, and it threatened to tear down the walls of polite society. The music industry was in a panic. They knew they couldn't stop rock and roll, but they were desperate to sanitize it. They needed an antidote to Elvis. They needed a boy who could sing the songs but wouldn't corrupt the youth. They needed an anti-Elvis. They found their perfect candidate in George Hamilton IV. A Rose and a Baby Ruth was a monster hit. It climbed the pop charts. It sold 1 million copies. It was the perfect pop confection. George was suddenly a teen idol. He was thrown onto tour buses with the giants of the era. He toured with Buddy Holly. He toured with the Everly Brothers. He stood backstage and watched the chaos of the early rock and roll revolution. He saw the screaming girls. He saw the drugs beginning to creep in. He saw the sheer, raw, uncontainable energy of men like Jerry Lee Lewis. And George Hamilton IV recoiled. He didn't want to be dangerous. He didn't want to be a revolutionary. The chaos of rock and roll offended his deep-seated need for order and respectability. He looked at the sweat and the sex of the rock world, and he felt a profound discomfort. He wasn't built for the edge. He was built for the center. So he made a choice. It was a choice that would define his life and the life of the unborn son who would carry his name. He retreated. He looked toward Nashville. In the late 1950s, Nashville was trying to clean up its own act. It was moving away from the hillbilly image and embracing the Nashville sound, smooth, polished, corporate country music. It was a world of suits, not overalls. It was a world of gentlemen, not outlaws. It was the perfect hiding place for George Hamilton IV. In 1960, he made it official. He joined the Grand Ole Opry. He traded the pop charts for the country charts. He traded the screaming teenagers for polite applause. He began to construct the persona that would imprison him for the next 50 years. He became the gentleman. While other country stars were beginning to wear denim and grow their hair out, George put on a three-piece suit. While others sang about cheating and drinking, George sang about nostalgia. He sang Abilene. He sang Fort Worth, Dallas, or Houston. These were beautiful songs, undoubtedly, but they were safe. They were songs about places, not people. They were songs about longing for a home that never really existed. This is where the addiction began to take root. George discovered a powerful drug. It wasn't whiskey. It was approval. He realized that if he was nice, relentlessly, unfailingly, aggressively nice, people would open doors for him. He became the industry's favorite son. He never complained about a bad microphone. He never argued with a producer about a song choice. He never turned down an autograph request, even if he was exhausted, even if his dinner was getting cold. He built a brand based on being the man who never said no. But psychologists have a term for this kind of extreme performative niceness. They call it a defense mechanism. It is a fortress. If I am perfect, you cannot criticize me. If I am a saint, you cannot be angry with me. If I am smiling, you cannot see that I am empty. George IV built a fortress of cotton wool, and inside that fortress, he hid from the messiness of real human intimacy. He hid from conflict. He hid from anger. He hid from the complicated, dirty reality of being a husband and a father. He married his high school sweetheart, Adelaide Tinky Payton. They were the picture-perfect couple. They looked like figures atop a wedding cake. And in 1960, the same year George joined the Opry, they had a son. They named him George Hamilton Faye. From the moment the ink dried on the birth certificate, the boy's destiny was already being written by his father's public relations strategy. He wasn't just a child, he was an heir. He was the fifth. The name implied royalty. It implied a dynasty. It implied that there was a great and noble lineage that had to be upheld. But a name is a heavy thing for a baby to carry. Growing up in the Hamilton household in the suburbs of Nashville was a confusing, disorienting experience for young Hege. To the outside world, he was the luckiest boy in America. His father was a star. His father was rich. His father was the nicest man alive. But the reality inside the house was defined by one overwhelming factor: absence. George IV's hunger for applause was insatiable. Conquering the American country charts wasn't enough. He needed more love. He needed more strangers to tell him he was good. So, in the late 1960s, he did something no other country star was doing. He looked across the ocean. He began to tour internationally. He went to England. He went to Ireland. He went to New Zealand. He went to Hong Kong. He went to the Soviet Union. He became the International Ambassador of Country Music. It was a brilliant marketing title. It set him apart from the other Nashville stars who rarely left the South. But for the family back home, the title ambassador was just a fancy word for gone. Hege grew up with a father who was a postcard. He was a voice on the radio. He was a face on a television screen. He was a man who was loved by millions of people in Prague and London and Belfast, but who was a stranger at the breakfast table in Tennessee. And when the ambassador did come home, he was unreachable. Hege would later describe a father who was physically present but emotionally playing a role. George IV would come home from a 6-week tour of Europe, walk through the front door, and he wouldn't switch off. He would sit in his armchair, wearing his crisp shirt, and he would smile that same beatific marble smile he used on stage. If there was a problem at school, George smiled. If Tinky was upset, George smiled. If Hege was angry, George smiled. He retreated into silence. He practiced a form of passive-aggressive sainthood. He refused to engage in the messy business of family conflict. He simply floated above it, untouchable in his goodness. How do you fight with a saint? How do you scream at the nicest man in the world? You can't. You just swallow your anger. You just learn that your feelings are an inconvenience to the great man's peace of mind. Haig learned early on that the only way to get his father's attention was to be part of the act. If he played the role of the adored son, George would beam with pride. If he posed for the photos, George would put his arm around him. He wasn't a son. He was a prop in the George Hamilton IV story. He was evidence that the ambassador was a good family man. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the boy grew older. He began to look at the smiling man in the suit, and he began to feel a strange, boiling resentment. He didn't want an ambassador. He wanted a dad. He didn't want a legend. He wanted a human being. But the legend was all there was. The human being had been consumed by the persona years ago. George Hamilton IV had become the mask. And as Haig entered his teenage years, standing on the precipice of manhood, he began to realize that the name he carried, George Hamilton V, was not a gift. It was a target. It was a set of expectations that he had never agreed to. He looked at the suit in his father's closet. He looked at the polished guitar, and he felt a terrifying thought take root in his mind. Is this it? Is this who I have to be? It was a cruel echo of history. In 1956, the music industry had forced the father into a golden cage labeled the gentleman, stripping away his humanity to create an idol. Now, 20 years later, that same cage was closing around the son. George IV had lost his youth to the pressure of being perfect. Now Haig was losing his youth to the pressure of being the heir. They were two prisoners sharing the same cell, separated by a generation, but united by the same lack of freedom. The stage was set for a rebellion, but in the world of the Hamiltons, even rebellion would prove to be a trap. The velvet cage was waiting, and the door was wide open. By the time George Hamilton V entered his teenage years in the mid-1970s, the suffocating perfection of his father's world had begun to curdle into a personal crisis. The household in suburban Nashville was a museum of manners, a place where voices were never raised and conflicts were smothered under a blanket of aggressive politeness. To an outsider, it was paradise. To a young man trying to forge an identity, it was a room without oxygen. Haig looked at the silver-haired man across the dinner table, the man who was always smiling, always impeccably dressed, always on, and felt a desperate, clawing need to shatter the glass. The cultural landscape of Nashville in the 1970s offered a perfect weapon for this rebellion. The city was in the midst of a civil war. On one side was the establishment, the countrypolitan sound of string sections and rhinestone suits ruled by the Grand Ole Opry and men like George Hamilton IV. On the other side was the outlaw movement. Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Tom Paul Glaser were tearing down the walls of Music Row. They grew their hair long, they wore denim and leather, they drank hard, and they played music that sounded like it had been dragged through the dirt behind a motorcycle. For Haig, the outlaw movement wasn't just a musical preference. It was a lifeline. It offered a template for masculinity that was the exact opposite of his father's gentleman persona. If George IV was the safe, clean-cut ambassador who drank milk and shook hands with Billy Graham, Haig would be the dangerous, brooding poet who drank whiskey and hung out in dive bars. He began the physical transformation first. The short, neat haircut that his father favored was replaced by a shaggy, shoulder-length mane. The pressed slacks and button-down shirts were discarded for worn denim jeans and leather jackets. He picked up an electric guitar, turning the volume knob past the polite levels acceptable at the Opry. He wanted to look like a man who had slept in his clothes, a direct visual affront to the father who looked like he slept in a tuxedo. But in the Hamilton household, rebellion was met with a weapon far more effective than anger: tolerance. When Haig walked into the living room dressed like a roadie for the Allman Brothers, George IV didn't scream. He didn't forbid it. He didn't quote scripture or threaten to cut off his allowance. Instead, he offered that same placid, maddening grin. "Well, son," he would say in his smooth, radio-ready baritone, "you certainly look comfortable." This reaction was devastating. It is impossible to be a rebel when the authority figure refuses to be the villain. George IV's toxic niceness absorbed the shock of Haig's defiance like a sponge. By refusing to engage in conflict, by refusing to be shocked or angry, the father denied the son the friction he needed to spark a fire. Haig was punching a cloud. He wanted a fight, a scream, a moment of raw honesty where his father would drop off the ambassador mask and just be a disappointed dad. But the mask never slipped. George IV supported Haig's phase with the same bland, terrifying enthusiasm he applied to a church picnic. Undeterred by the lack of domestic fireworks, Haig took his rebellion to the streets of Nashville. He formed a band. He started writing songs. He wasn't trying to sing Abilene or A Rose and a Baby Ruth. He was writing rock songs, gritty country rock tracks with distorted guitars and driving drums. He was trying to sound like Steve Earle or the Kentucky Headhunters long before those acts broke through. He wanted to prove that he had grit, that he wasn't just a soft sequel to a soft man. Haig possessed a genuine talent. He had a voice, Samit, that was distinct from his father's, rougher, deeper, with a serrated edge that hinted at the frustration boiling beneath the surface. He was a capable guitarist and a songwriter with a modern sensibility. In a vacuum, he might have been a contender. But George Hamilton V did not exist in a vacuum. He existed in the long, cold shadow of the Roman numeral at the end of his name. When he walked into meetings on Music Row clutching his demo tapes, the executives didn't see a new artist. They saw a marketing hook. They saw George Hamilton's kid. The conversations never started with the music. They started with the lineage. "How's your daddy?" they would ask. "Is George still touring Europe? You look just like him around the eyes." The industry viewed Haig through a lens of cognitive dissonance. They couldn't reconcile the visual of the long-haired rocker with the brand equity of the name George Hamilton. The name stood for safety. It stood for family values. It stood for the Grand Ole Opry. Trying to sell a dangerous George Hamilton was like trying to sell a satanic Disney movie. It violated the core logic of the brand. Executives would listen to his tapes, nodding politely, and then offer the same crushing advice. "This is good, Haig, but couldn't you do something a little more traditional? Maybe cut one of your dad's old hits? The folks would love that." They wanted a clone. They wanted a younger, fresher version of the ambassador to sell to the next generation of housewives. They didn't want an artist with his own perspective. They wanted a legacy act that could extend the copyright on the Hamilton empire. Haig resisted. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, he fought to establish a solo identity. He played the clubs, sweating through sets of original material, trying to win over audiences that were often populated by people who had come expecting to hear his father's music. He would stand on stage looking out at the crowd and see the confusion in their eyes. They didn't want the loud guitars. They wanted the comfort of the past. There were minor victories. He released a few singles. He got some airplay on independent stations. There were moments when it seemed like he might break through the wall. Moments when the music press would acknowledge him as an artist in his own right. But the breakthrough never came. The hits didn't chart. The major labels didn't bite. The outlaw movement he idolized had peaked and was being replaced by the slicker, pop-oriented urban cowboy sound, leaving him stranded between eras. The psychological toll of this failure was compounded by his father's relentless, suffocating support. George the Fourth would come to Hage's shows. He would stand in the back wearing his suit, beaming with pride. He would clap the loudest. After the set, he would come backstage and tell Hage how proud he was. To an observer, this looks like love, and perhaps it was. But to Hage it felt like a curse. His father's approval felt generic, the same approval he gave to a waiter who brought the check on time or a fan who asked for a photo. It lacked specificity. Did he like the songs? Did he understand the anger in the lyrics? Did he realize that half the set was a scream directed at him? It didn't seem to matter. George the Fourth was proud because Hage was his son, and that was the role the son was supposed to play. The content of Hage's life was irrelevant. Only the performance mattered. This dynamic created a state of arrested development for Hage. He was a man in his 20s, then his 30s, still defined entirely by his relationship to his father. He couldn't fail on his own terms because his father's safety net was always there, catching him with a smile. He couldn't succeed on his own terms because the world wouldn't let him unzip the son of costume. Hage wasn't just living in his father's shadow. He was being erased by his father's light. Every thank you from a fan was a nail in the coffin of his own identity. As the 1980s progressed, the ground began to shift for both men. The music industry is a cruel ecosystem, and it was preparing to shed its skin again. The urban cowboy phase faded, and a new generation of traditionalists, the class of '89, was preparing to take over. Garth Brooks, Alan Jackson, Clint Black. These were young men who wore hats and sang about the country, but they did it with the energy of arena rock. In this new world, George Hamilton IV was becoming an artifact. The hits had dried up long ago. American radio had completely stopped playing his new records. The bookings in the United States were moving from theaters to county fairs to high school auditoriums. The ambassador was losing his diplomatic immunity at home. He was becoming a nostalgia act, a living museum piece to be trotted out for anniversaries and special occasions, but ignored the rest of the year. This decline should have been Hage's opportunity. With the father's shadow shrinking, perhaps there was finally room for the son to find the light. But the cruel irony of the Hamilton legacy was that as George IV's star faded, the demand for the brand of George Hamilton became even more rigid. The shrinking audience didn't want new things. They clung even harder to the old things. The fans who remained were the diehards, the ones who wanted the memory of 1960 preserved in amber. They had even less patience for Hage's rock ambitions than the mainstream audience. Hage found himself at a crossroads. His solo career was stalling. The money was tight. The rebellion had run its course, and he had nothing to show for it but a closet full of denim jackets and a stack of unsold demo tapes. He was approaching middle age, and he was still Hage, the nickname of a boy, not the name of a man. It was in this atmosphere of mutual decline that the idea was born. It didn't happen in a dramatic confrontation. It happened in quiet conversations about bills and bookings. The father needed help. He needed a band leader who knew the material, someone cheap, someone loyal, someone who wouldn't quit when the tours got unglamorous. The son needed a paycheck. He needed a stage, even if it wasn't the one he had dreamed of. The inevitable gravity of the family business began to pull Hage back in. He started sitting in on his father's sets, just a few songs here and there, playing rhythm guitar, singing harmony. The first time they sang together on stage, the reaction was electric. Not because the music was revolutionary, but because it triggered the audience's sentimental endorphins. Seeing the father and the son, the silver-haired legend and the long-haired heir, standing side by side reassured the crowd. It told them that everything was okay, that the tradition continued, that the values of the past were safe. They clapped louder for Haga the son than they ever had for Haga the solo artist. Haga felt the seduction of that applause. It was a trap, and he knew it. It was the applause of capitulation. They were clapping because he had surrendered, because he had cut his hair a little shorter, put on a nicer shirt, and agreed to play the role he was born for. He justified it to himself. It was temporary. It was just to help his dad out for a while. It was a way to make some money to fund his real music. He told himself he wasn't selling out. He was just being a good son. But deep down, he must have felt the heavy iron door of the cage beginning to swing shut. The 1990s approached, marking the end of the rebellion. It was a partnership sealed by necessity, moving the stage from the changing landscape of American country music to a place where the past was still revered. The boy who wanted to be an outlaw was about to become his father's keeper, tasked with polishing a crown that was slowly losing its luster. In the United States, the rise of new country, the pyrotechnic, stadium-filling spectacle of Garth Brooks and Shania Twain, had rendered George Hamilton the fourth effectively invisible. To the new power brokers on Music Row, the ambassador was a relic of a black and white era, a man whose gentle folk country ballads had no place on playlists dominated by rock-influenced anthems about pickup trucks and beer. But across the Atlantic, time moved slower. In the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Northern Europe, the audience was older, more loyal, and deeply sentimental. They didn't care about the Billboard charts, they cared about history. To them, George Hamilton IV was still royalty, a direct link to the golden age of the Grand Ole Opry. And so, the Hamiltons packed their bags and turned their eyes east, becoming musical exiles who lived out of suitcases in a perpetual state of transit. The reality of these international tours bore little resemblance to the glamorous title of ambassador. There were no private jets or entourages of handlers. The logistics of the George Hamilton 4 and V tours were stripped down to the bone. They flew commercial, often in economy, and upon landing in London or Dublin or Glasgow, they would rent a van. This vehicle, usually a nondescript Ford Transit or a Mercedes Sprinter, became the crucible of their relationship for the next 2 decades. It was a mobile containment unit where the father and son sat shoulder to shoulder for hours on end, navigating the roundabouts and rainy motorways of the British Isles. The silence in that van was heavy with things unsaid. Beside him, George IV would stare out the window, his body aching with age, his energy depleted, yet he maintained his composure. He was terrified that if he slumped, if he complained, the ambassador would crumble. Haga, gripping the steering wheel, wanted to break the silence, to ask the man behind the suit how he really felt. But the weight of the persona crushed the words in his throat. They sat inches apart, separated only by a gear stick. 2 men who loved each other, but had forgotten how to speak without a microphone. He was the roadie, hauling amplifiers and guitar cases into the venues. Sometimes these were prestigious theaters, but just as often they were drafty village halls or the back rooms of pubs. He was the sound engineer, tweaking the levels to ensure the Hamilton sound remained pristine. And finally, he was the opening act, warming up the crowd with a few songs before stepping back into the shadows to support the main attraction. The dynamic inside the van was a masterclass in passive control. George IV, ever the gentleman, never issued orders in a harsh voice. He didn't need to. He ruled through assumption. He assumed Haga would handle the luggage. He assumed Haga would deal with the promoters who tried to shortchange them. He assumed the set list would remain exactly as it had been in 1975. When Haga would suggest shaking things up, perhaps dropping a tired ballad for a more upbeat number, or rearranging a classic to give it a modern edge, George IV would not argue. He would simply flash his practiced stage look and say gently, "I think the folks are really looking forward to hearing it the old way, son." It was a veto wrapped in velvet. The suggestion would die in the air, killed by kindness, and Hager would turn his eyes back to the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The performances themselves were a nightly ritual of erasure for the sun. As the lights went down, George IV would undergo a transformation that was almost biological. The fatigue of travel, the financial worries, the creeping age, all of it would vanish the moment he stepped into the spotlight. He became the avatar of niceness. He told the same stories he had told for 40 years, with the same inflection, the same pauses for laughter, the same twinkle in his eye. He dedicated songs to the local dignitaries. He shook hands from the stage. He fed on the adoration of the crowd with a voracious hunger that Hege, standing a few feet away with a rhythm guitar, could feel radiating off him like heat. For the audience, seeing Hege there was a comforting accessory. "Look," their eyes seemed to say, "George is such a good man. Even his son wants to be just like him." They didn't see a 35-year-old man, and later a 40-year-old man whose own artistic identity was being slowly suffocated. They saw a mini George, a guarantee that the brand would continue. Hege played his part dutifully. He sang the harmonies. He smiled when his father introduced him as "my pride and joy." But internally, a dissonance was growing. He was singing songs about a rural, idyllic America that no longer existed for an audience in misty England, while his own life, his desire to rock, to write, to be real, was paused indefinitely. This sense of dislocation was most acute during their ventures into Eastern Europe, a specific chapter of their touring life that highlights the delusional quality of the ambassador's later years. George Hamilton IV had been the first country star to tour behind the Iron Curtain in the 1970s, a feat he wore as a badge of honor. In the post-Cold War era, he returned frequently to places like the Czech Republic, Poland, and the Baltic states. In these regions, the time warp was even more pronounced. The audiences there treated him not just as a singer, but as a visiting head of state, a symbol of American freedom and culture. The Czechoslovakia tour, as George IV insisted on calling it, even after the country split, became a recurring pilgrimage. They would play in grand Soviet-era concert halls to packed crowds who hung on every word. For George IV, these trips were a narcotic. In Nashville, he was a nobody who couldn't get a table at a trendy restaurant. In Prague, he was a king. Hege witnessed the disparity firsthand. He saw how his father chased the high of these tours, often agreeing to perform for fees that barely covered their airfare, just to feel that wave of unconditional love. Hege was the one who had to manage the reality behind the curtain. He dealt with the broken equipment, the language barriers, the freezing dressing rooms, and the exhausting travel schedules that would have broken men half their age. He watched his father agree to every interview, every meet and greet, extending their days into the early morning hours. George was driven by a pathological need to be the most accessible star in the world. When Hege would plead for rest, arguing that George IV's health was fragile, the father would dismiss the concern with a wave of his hand. "These folks have waited a long time to see us, Hege. We can't let them down." The "we" was a coercive tool. It implicated Haig in the mission, making any protest feel like a betrayal of the fans. This toxic niceness extended to their financial dealings. George IV's refusal to be confrontational meant that he was often taken advantage of by promoters. He would agree to handshake deals that evaporated when it came time to pay. He would play charity benefits where the charity was dubious. Simply because he couldn't say no to a request for help, Hege, trying to act as a manager, would attempt to enforce contracts or demand payment only to be undermined by his father. "Now, Hege, let's not make a fuss," George would say, effectively cutting the legs out from under his son's authority. It cast Hege in the role of the bad guy, the greedy son, while George remained the saint who cared only about the music. As the 1990s bled into the 2000s, the physical toll of this lifestyle began to manifest. George IV was aging. The silver hair was thinning, the frame becoming more frail. But the machine could not stop. The Ambassador brand required constant maintenance. They were running on a treadmill where the speed kept increasing even as their energy flagged. For Hege, the personal cost was devastating. He was entering his middle age having sacrificed the rhythms of a normal domestic life, with the tour bus serving as his only true home. His life was the van, the hotel room, and the stage. His peers back in Nashville were building careers, families, and 401ks. Hege was building nothing but a collection of backstage passes, and the lingering resentment of a man who realizes he has spent the prime of his life servicing another man's ego. The dynamic on stage began to shift imperceptibly. The father needed the son more than ever, not just for musical support, but for physical support. Hege became the cane that George IV leaned on. He covered for his father's missed chords. He took over the high notes that George could no longer reach. He filled the dead air when George would lose his train of thought during a story. The audience saw a seamless show, but Hege felt the weight of the entire performance resting on his shoulders. He was propping up a monument that was beginning to crumble, frantically applying plaster to the cracks, while the audience cheered for the statue. In the rare moments of downtime, sitting in a pub in Dublin or a cafe in Oslo, Hege would sometimes try to breach the wall. He would try to talk to his father about the future, about money, about the reality that this couldn't go on forever. But George IV had perfected the art of deflection. He would talk about the weather. He would talk about a nice letter he received from a fan. He would talk about how blessed they were to be seeing the world. He refused to inhabit the real world of consequences. He lived entirely in the construct of the ambassador, a world where everything was fine, everyone was lovely, and the next show would fix everything. This emotional unavailability was the quiet violence of their partnership. George IV gave the best of himself to the public, his warmth, his attention, his charm, and left the scraps for his son. The physical closeness in the cab only amplified the emotional distance. They were divided by an ocean of unsaid words. The silence between them was heavier than the miles they traveled. The son starved for a moment of genuine, unmasked connection, for a father who would drop the act and say, "I'm scared," or "I'm tired," or "I'm sorry." But the act was the man. There was nothing underneath the suit anymore. The tragedy of the 2000s was the tragedy of inertia. They kept going because they didn't know how to stop. The tours became a blur of airports and highways. The venues blurred together. The applause became a white noise that drowned out the warning signs. Haig stopped writing songs. The guitar case containing his rock demos was left in a closet in Nashville, gathering dust. He stopped trying to be an outlaw. He accepted his role as the squire to the night, the eternal subordinate. He began to dress more like his father, adopting the jackets and the slacks, molding himself into the successor the audience expected. The rebellion of his youth was not crushed by force. It was eroded by the gentle, relentless tide of his father's expectations. By 2010, the George Hamilton The 4 and V show was a well-oiled machine of nostalgia, running on fumes. The crowds in the UK were thinning as the older generation passed away, but the Hamiltons kept playing. They played to half-empty halls with the same enthusiasm they had played to packed theaters. George IV's denial was absolute. He couldn't see the empty seats. He only saw the faces of the faithful who remained. Haig saw the empty seats. He did the math. He knew they were losing money, but he drove the van to the next town anyway because he couldn't bear to break his father's heart, and because, after 20 years on the road, he no longer knew who he was if he wasn't George Hamilton's son. The end of this era did not come with a retirement party or a final farewell tour. It came with the brutal intervention of biology, shattering the illusion that the ambassador was immortal. But before the final curtain fell, there would be a few more years of desperate scrambling, a few more trips to the well, and the slow revelation of the financial abyss that awaited them both. The van kept rolling through the rain, carrying two men named George, bound together by a love that looked suspiciously like captivity. As the first decade of the new millennium dissolved into the second, the physical machinery of George Hamilton IV began to fail, creating a dissonance between the ageless persona he projected and the biological reality of a man in his mid-70s. The international ambassador had built a career on consistency. The same haircut, the same smile, the same smooth baritone that had comforted listeners since the Eisenhower administration. But age is an adversary that cannot be charmed, negotiated with, or killed with kindness. The silver hair was thinning, requiring more careful styling to maintain the illusion of volume. The frame inside the tailored three-piece suits was shrinking, the shoulders becoming more angular, the posture slightly more stooped. For Haig, the role shifted from road manager to caregiver. The grueling tours across the UK transformed into high-wire acts of medical management. He watched his father's energy levels with the hawk-like intensity of a doctor monitoring a patient's vitals. He noticed the tremors in the hands that gripped the microphone and the breathless exhaustion that followed every performance. He saw the way George IV would slump in the passenger seat the moment they were out of the public eye, his face gray and drawn, recharging his batteries just enough to turn the lights back on for the next meet and greet. Yet the show did not stop. It could not stop. The momentum of 50 years was too great to arrest. George IV operated under a delusion of necessity, convinced that if he missed a date in a small town in Yorkshire or a church hall in Belfast, he would be betraying a sacred trust. When Haig pleaded for them to scale back, to do one tour instead of two, George simply offered that impenetrable smile. "We're booked, son," he would say, treating a gig contract in a village hall like a divine commandment. To stop was to admit mortality, and for the ambassador, silence was a fate worse than death. The voice, that golden instrument that had sustained the Hamilton Empire, began to fray. The rich, honeyed low notes were still there, but the power behind them was waning. Haig found himself singing louder in the harmonies, filling out the sound, effectively carrying the vocal load, while his father provided the texture. It was a sonic metaphor for their lives, the son doing the heavy lifting while the father took the bow. The audiences, loyal to a fault, pretended not to notice. They clapped just as hard for the shadow as they had for the man, their applause driven by memory rather than the performance in front of them. In 2011 and 2012, the financial cracks in the foundation began to widen, mirroring the physical decline. The economics of the music industry had shifted so radically that the ambassador model was no longer sustainable, yet George IV refused to adapt his business practices. He continued to accept invitations for prestige rather than profit. He would agree to perform at festivals or charity events where the exposure was high, but the fee was negligible, often costing them money and travel expenses. Hege, attempting to manage the ledger, would point out the red ink. "Dad, this trip to Poland is going to cost us $3,000 just in flights and hotels. The fee is $500. We can't do it." George would look at the spreadsheet with a glazed expression, refusing to engage with the math. "It's good for the brand, Hege. It keeps our name out there." The brand was eating the man alive. The obsession with being the omnipresent ambassador meant that George IV was hemorrhaging cash to maintain an illusion of relevance. He was funding his own popularity, buying the love of strangers with the remnants of his retirement savings. Hege, dependent on the tour income for his own survival, felt the walls closing in. He was trapped in a sinking ship whose captain insisted on polishing the brass rails while the water rose around their ankles. By 2013, the situation had become critical. George IV's health took a sharp turn for the worse. The stamina that had allowed him to tour relentlessly was gone. There were moments of confusion, brief lapses where the sharp mind that remembered the name of every DJ in America seemed to falter. Retirement was never an option. To stop meant admitting mortality, and for the ambassador, silence was a fate worse than death. The end came not on a stage in London or Prague, but in the sterile quiet of a hospital in Nashville. In September 2014, the heart that had been pledged to the world finally gave out. George Hamilton IV suffered a massive heart attack. He was rushed to St. Thomas Midtown Hospital, the medical hub for Nashville's music elite. The days spent in the hospital were a surreal coda to his life. Even as he lay in the bed, hooked up to monitors, fading in and out of consciousness, the gentleman persona remained intact. Nurses would comment on how polite he was, how he still tried to smile when they adjusted his IVs. He was performing his final set, playing the role of the noble sufferer with flawless commitment. Hege sat by the bedside, watching the man he had served for 25 years slowly detach from the world. There were no grand confessions, no tearful breakthroughs, where the father finally dropped the mask and apologized for the years of emotional absence. The mask was fused to the skin. George Hamilton IV died as he lived, pleasant, distant, and utterly impenetrable. He passed away on September 17th, 2014. He was 77 years old. The news of his death triggered a wave of public mourning that washed over Nashville and rippled across the Atlantic. The obituaries were glowing. The New York Times, the BBC, and Rolling Stone all ran tributes hailing him as the international ambassador of country music. They spoke of his dignity, his kindness, his role in popularizing country music globally. They printed the photo of the young George in his high-collar sweater from 1956 and the old George in his suit from 2010. The narrative was cemented. Here lay a saint of the genre, a man without sin. The funeral was a state affair for Music City. It was held at the Ryman Auditorium, the mother church of country music. The pews where George had once played for 3,000 people were now filled with mourners. Country stars, industry executives, and fans filed past the casket. Hege stood at the center of it all, the chief mourner, shaking hands, accepting condolences. "Your father was a great man," they told him over and over again. "He was the nicest man I ever met." Hege nodded, said thank you, and played the part of the grieving son. He felt a numbness spreading through him, a dissociation from the reality of the loss. He wasn't just grieving a father. He was grieving the boss who had employed him, the anchor that had held him in place, and the barrier that had kept him from his own life. But the true shock, the event that would define the next chapter of Hege's life, came after the flowers had wilted and the guests had gone home. It came in the quiet office of an estate attorney, where the financial autopsy of the Hamilton legacy was performed. The assumption, shared by Hague and the world, was that George Hamilton IV was a wealthy man. He had been a star for nearly 60 years. He had written hits. He had sold millions of records. He had toured incessantly. Surely there was a vault. Surely there was a trust fund, a portfolio of investments, a cushion that would allow his widow and his son to live comfortably. The reading of the financial statements was a moment of vertigo. The vault was empty. George Hamilton IV died with almost nothing. The revelation was staggering. The money hadn't gone to drugs or gambling. It had been consumed by the persona itself. Being George Hamilton IV was an expensive fiction. Decades of international diplomacy, charity concerts, and maintaining the image had drained the accounts dry. George had operated with the financial logic of a child, believing that being good meant being provided for. He left the world with a clean soul, but he left his son with an empty ledger. Hague stared at the documents, feeling the floor drop out from under him. There was the house in Nashville, modest and mortgaged. There were the rights to some songs, but the publishing on the biggest hits had been sold off or diluted years ago. There was no cash. George Hamilton IV's pathological generosity had a price tag, and he had left the bill for his son to pay. Hague was 54 years old. He had no savings of his own, having worked for his father for a salary that barely covered his living expenses. He had no solo career to fall back on. The name George Hamilton IV had zero market value as an independent artist. He had no other skills. He had spent his adult life driving a van and playing rhythm guitar. The death of the king did not liberate the prince. It impoverished him. Hague realized with a sickening clarity that he could not afford to grieve. He could not take a year off to find himself. He had bills to pay. He had to support his mother. He had to keep the lights on. And the only asset he had inherited, the only thing of value George IV had left him, was the name. The market didn't want Hague Hamilton, the rock musician, but there was still a market for the memory of George Hamilton IV. The promoters in the UK were calling. The festivals in Ireland were calling. They offered condolences, and in the same breath, they asked, "Will you keep the music alive?" It was a devil's bargain. To survive, Hague would have to become a tribute act to his own father. He would have to step into the dead man's suits. He would have to sing the dead man's songs. He would have to adopt the dead man's mannerisms. He had spent 25 years standing in the wings waiting for his turn. Now the stage was empty, but he wasn't free to build his own set. He was condemned to reenact the play night after night for an audience that was applauding a ghost. The empty vault left Hague with a brutal ultimatum: starve as himself or survive as a ghost. The transformation began in the quiet of the wardrobe closet in the modest house in Nashville, a space that smelled of cedar, old fabric, and the faint lingering scent of the cologne George Hamilton IV had worn for 50 years. Hague stood before the rows of three-piece suits, a silent army of garments that chronicled the history of country music fashion from the conservative 60s to the nostalgic 2000s. He reached for a gray suit, conservative, well-cut, the uniform of the ambassador. When he slipped his arms into the jacket, the fit was uncanny. They were roughly the same height, roughly the same build, though Hague's shoulders were perhaps a fraction broader, hardened by decades of hauling amplifiers that his father had only stood in front of. He stood before the mirror and began the process of erasure. The long hair of his rebellious youth was long gone, but now the styling had to be precise. He combed it back, exposing the forehead, mimicking the silver wave that had been his father's crown. He adjusted his posture, softening the aggressive stance of a rock guitarist into the gentle, open stoop of a folk singer. He practiced the smile. It wasn't a natural smile, it was a muscle memory he had observed from the passenger seat of the van for 20 years. It was a smile that didn't reach the eyes but signaled to the world that everything was fine, that everyone was welcome, that no conflict would ever be acknowledged here. Hager realized he wasn't just inheriting a wardrobe. He was stepping into a cell. He was no longer just the son, he was the vessel. The George Hamilton IV show would go on, but the man standing center stage would be a hollow shell. Stepping onto the stage for the first time as the headliner of the tribute show was not an act of performance, it was a seance. Hager walked out to the center microphone, the spot he had avoided for half his life, and looked out at the audience. They were the same people who had cheered for his father. Elderly couples in Ireland, church groups in Scotland, country music clubs in Scandinavia. They looked at him with a mixture of grief and hunger. They missed George. They wanted George back. And when Hager opened his mouth to speak, dropping his voice an octave to match the soothing baritone of the ambassador, he gave them what they wanted. Hager didn't just interpret the music, he became a medium for the dead. He mimicked every breath, every strum, and even adopted the ambassador's vocabulary, using words that felt foreign in his mouth to keep the spell alive. The audience reaction was a wave of relief that washed over the footlights. They closed their eyes and let the timeline collapse. For 90 minutes, George Hamilton IV wasn't dead. He was right there. They applauded the ghost, and Hager, standing in the center of the noise, realized the full extent of his prison. They weren't clapping for him, they were clapping for the costume. If he were to stop the show, strip off the jacket, pick up an electric guitar, and play one of the gritty songs he had written in 1982, the room would turn to ice. They loved him only as long as he wasn't himself. This new reality necessitated a return to the road, but the van felt different now. It was haunted. The passenger seat, where George IV had napped and smiled and deflected serious conversations, was empty. Hager drove the familiar routes through the English rain, passing the same landmarks, staying in the same budget hotels. The silence in the vehicle was absolute. There was no one to manage anymore, no one to protect, no one to be frustrated with. He was the captain of the ship now, but the ship was a ghost vessel sailing in circles. The economics of the tribute tour were precarious. Without the actual legend on the bill, the fees dropped. Hager was working twice as hard for half the money. He had to be his own road manager, booking agent, and merchandiser. He sold CDs in the lobby after the show, compilations of his father's hits, and perhaps a small stack of his own solo albums tucked away in the corner, ignored by the patrons who wanted the nostalgia. He shook every hand. He signed autographs, sometimes signing George Hamilton live, but often just George Hamilton, the numeral blurring into insignificance. He listened to hundreds of people tell him, "You look just like your daddy." He smiled and said, "Thank you. That's a compliment," burying the scream that rose in his throat every single time. This existence created a profound psychological dissociation. Hager began to lose track of where the act ended and the man began. When you spend 200 nights a year pretending to be someone else, the mask begins to eat into the skin. He found himself using his father's mannerisms off stage. He found himself avoiding conflict in his personal life, retreating into that toxic niceness he had once despised. He realized with a chilling dread that he wasn't just imitating his father, he was becoming him. The George Hamilton Fay, who wanted to be an outlaw, the man with distinct tastes and opinions and anger, was atrophying from disuse. The years rolled on, 2016, 2018, 2020. The world outside the venue changed. Politics became polarized, technology accelerated, the music industry evolved into streaming algorithms. But inside the George Hamilton Ford tribute show, Time remained frozen in 1965. Hege was the curator of a museum that traveled with him. He sang about a simple moral universe that no longer existed, perhaps never existed, for an audience that was frantically clinging to the past as they aged. He was selling comfort. He was a musical hospice worker, easing the passage of the older generation by singing them the lullabies of their youth. There were moments late at night in a hotel bar in Belfast or Glasgow when the cracks would show. Hege would order a drink, whiskey usually, and sit alone in the corner. The ambassador mask would slip, and the face of a tired middle-aged man would emerge. A man who realized he had no legacy of his own. He had no a Rose and a baby Ruth. He had no Abilene. He had only the echo. He would look at his reflection in the glass and see a stranger. He had spent his youth waiting for his turn, only to find that his turn was just an encore for a show that had ended. The financial trap remained clamped tight. He couldn't afford to stop. The mortgage in Nashville needed to be paid. The legacy required maintenance. To quit the tribute act would be to accept poverty. The market had spoken. Hege Hamilton had value only as a derivative product. As a standalone asset, he was worthless. So he finished the drink, went upstairs, slept for 6 hours, and woke up to iron the suit for the next show. This cycle is the ultimate culmination of the Hamilton curse. It is a curse of erasure. The father's ego was so large, his need for validation so consuming, that it swallowed the son whole. George IV didn't destroy his son with abuse. He destroyed him with a suffocating embrace. He loved Hege so much he wanted him to be exactly like himself, and in doing so, he denied Hege the right to be anyone else. As we look at the Hamilton dynasty today, the tragedy is not one of fire and brimstone, but of a slow, quiet fading. George Hamilton Feith is now an older man himself. The resemblance to his father is no longer just a result of styling, it is biological destiny. The gravity of genetics has pulled him into the final shape. He stands on the stages of county fairs and small theaters, a silver-haired gentleman with a guitar, singing songs about trains and roses. The audience applauds, but they are applauding a memory. They are looking through Hege to see the ghost standing behind him, and Hege knows it. He accepts it. He smiles, that beatific, impenetrable smile, waves to the crowd and says, "I love you." But who is saying it? Is it the son, or is it the father, speaking through the son's mouth, claiming one final ovation from beyond the grave? The lights go down. The crowd disperses, warmed by the fire of nostalgia. The man on stage packs up his guitar, folds the suit carefully into the case, and walks out the back door to the van. He sits in the driver's seat alone in the silence. He checks the map for the next town. He turns the key. The engine starts. And George Hamilton Feith drives into the night, a man carrying a hollow crown, the last ambassador of a kingdom that has vanished into the mist, leaving behind no heir, only an echo that grows fainter with every mile.